So we're going to talk today about an infamous crime, a story that I learned many years ago from a couple of gentlemen that were kind enough to take a young kid and spend a little time with him to tell him about this this horrible crime that happened. I'd like to thank, they've been gone for years. I'd like to thank C.W. Webb Scheider, who was born in 1894. He was 12 when this crime was committed. And I'd like to thank Orlando Hill. And I actually had a chance to interview Orlando Hill in 1991 when he was 102 years old. And he was kind enough to let me tape him, so I actually have the audio of the Orlando Hill interview, which makes it even a little more special for me. We're going to go back to 1875, between 1875 and 1880, when an Irishman moved to Charles City by the name of James Cullen. He was in his 30s, and he was kind of an odd sort. From the time he moved to Charles City, he was he had a temper problem. He was a temperate Irishman, so he didn't partake in any. He didn't imbibe. He was a sober Irishman, and he was immediately used Jim made wooden tanks, watertight wooden tanks. He was quite a craftsman, and making watertight wooden tanks was a real art back in those days. They were much cheaper than metal tanks, water tanks. So a lot of people did business with him whether they liked him or not. He was not fond of kids. Webb Scheider told me that he specifically recalled Jim had a tank shop on Clark Street, real close to Main Street. And Webb specifically remembers when you were a kid, you wanted to stay away because if Jim was on a horse, he'd try to scare you. He'd head over towards you like he was going to run over you with a horse. He loved chasing kids, and he'd laugh. He got a big kick out of that. So Jim was in business, and he made some money. He did very well. He had a monopoly making wooden tanks. He did very, very well, and put some money away, and he bought property. I've owned a couple of pieces of property in Charles City that's got his name on the abstract. So in the downtown area, Jim invested and did pretty well with his money, and for those days he accumulated quite a sum. He became friends with bankers, lawyers, what few friends he had. Nan Fruden, who we'll talk about a little later, who had the Fruden lumber yard. That's where Jim bought all his material, and to this day there are Frudens in Charles City. So Jim put away some money. He in the late 1800s, he'd been married a couple of times, as I understood it. Orlando told me he thought he'd been married 2 times. There was a woman from Nashua who was married to Henry Eastman. And in 1901, Henry Eastman passed away, and that left his wife as a widow. And she had a son. His name was Roy. He was a big kid. His nickname was Fat. Called him Fat Eastman. He was a pretty good-sized kid. And for the next 5 years, Ella and Roy lived on their own. Somehow nobody's ever been able to figure out how Ella and Roy and Jim Cullen became friends. They really didn't seem, nobody knew that they were seeing each other, that Roy was calling on Ella. But in July of 1906, Roy and Ella and Jim went to Minneapolis, and Jim and Ella got married, Ella Eastman. And she was from around down around Nashua. She and Henry lived down there, and she moved to Charles City, and it was a surprise announcement in the paper that they got married. We could find the article back there. I've seen it before, a surprise wedding, and they got married, and nobody could understand why she married him, because he had a bad temper, and he was but there was this thing about him being well-to-do, and some people speculated that's why she wanted to marry him, was because she knows she'd be secure and whatever. But so we're up to July of 1907, and we know about Roy, the stepson, and Ella, the mother, and Jim, the stepfather and now husband of Ella Cullen and Roy Eastman. And they go on a few months, and Jim had a brother that lived in Minneapolis. His name was Bill, and he got a wire. Back in those days, they wired more than they called on the telephone. We did have telephones, but they used a wire, and they wired up to Minneapolis from Charles City, and it was from Jim, and Jim said, "Come quick." And this was before Christmas, in December of 1906. "Come quick, I'm sick." And so Bill got on the first train, and he came down here, and when he got to Charles City, he went to the house where they lived, which is up on Clark Street, still there. It's right at the end of, if you go to the corner of Clark and Hawkins, and you go right off the end of Hawkins to the north, you run right into the house. A lot of people think it's that old pebble-dashed house with vines all over it. It's not that one, it's the one next to it, towards town. And that's where they lived. Bill got into town, and he went right to the house and wondered, well, when he got there, Jim wasn't all that sick. He just wanted Bill down there for some reason, and he stayed a day, and then he went back to Minneapolis, and he was kind of confused as to why Jim wanted him to come to Charles City. Well, about a month later, on January 7th, Jim wired his brother again and said, "Come quick, I'm sick." Well, Bill thought, well, we're going through this again, but he decided I better go down. Maybe there's something wrong, because Jim at this time was in his 60s, and Ella was in her 40s, mid-40s, so there was about a 20-year difference in age between the two of them. And Bill jumped on the train and came down, and it was a late train. He didn't get the wire till late in the day, and he didn't actually get into the depot until about 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:30 in the morning. And when he got off the train, he immediately went to the house. And when he got to the house, it was dark, and he banged on the front door, and Jim lit a light. Back in those days, they didn't have electricity. He had lanterns, and Jim lit a light. He was sleeping on a cot right there in the entryway of the house. The bedroom was straight back. If you went in that door and went right to the back of the house, that's where Ella was in bed. And when Bill got there, Jim answered the door. He lit a light and answered the door, and when he went in, and Jim was all covered with blood. It was blood, and it was a mess. Roy, of course, was asleep upstairs, and by this time Roy was 17 years old. He was, like I said, he was a big kid. And they had roomers upstairs. L.E. Reed taught at the college grounds, and he had a room up there. And Orlando Hill, who I talked about when I got the interview, his sister lived there, but she'd taken sick, and she wasn't there. She'd gone to the house east of town. So she wasn't there that night, but L.E. Reed was upstairs. Well, when they got in there, Bill was like, what's going on? What happened? And he immediately went to the back room where Ella was, and when he got back there, the newspaper article shows that Jim had killed her with a dirk knife. And Jim kept saying she wanted the money, she wanted the money, she wanted the money. Some people figured that maybe he was concerned that she maybe was going to kill him to get his money or something. There was a lot of speculation about why this whole thing happened. But when they were making noise moving around down there, Roy woke up and he came downstairs and he saw Jim and he said, "Where's Ma?" And Jim and Roy got in kind of a tussle, and And he wanted to go. Well, Roy went back and he saw his mom back there, and she'd been stabbed, a lot, and she was dead in bed, had her throat cut. It was a terrible deal, and Roy was upset, and he went after Jim. Jim had that knife, and he was trying to slice Roy up, and they got into it, and Bill was trying to break him up, and they had a real ruckus there, and finally they got Roy away from Jim, and Bill said, "Go get the cop. We need to get the cop up here. We've got a problem. You got to run and get the cop." And Roy got in, threw a coat on real quick and headed out onto that porch, and he turned around, and like he was going to come after Jim again, Jim reached in his pocket of his night coat and pulled out a small gun, about like this, and he shot Roy in the eye. Killed him dead right on the front porch. So now we had Ella, who had been murdered in the back room, and Roy was dead on the front porch. Ellie Reed saw the whole thing. He'd come downstairs, and Bill went after the cop. And kitty corner from where the house is, there was a house on the corner, it'd be the southeast corner of Hawkins and Clark. F.E. Hirsch lived there, and he was the president of the Charles City College. And when this whole thing happened, Jim, Ella's dead, Roy's dead on the porch, Bill's gone to get the cop, Ellie Reed's left because he doesn't want to be around anymore, and Jim didn't have anybody there, so he went over to Hirsch's and banged on the door. And of course, Hirsch's woke up. Now this is about 4 o'clock in the morning. January 8th, 1907. So he wired for Bill on January 7th. Bill got into town early in the morning on January 8th. Now it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and Jim Cullen there's nobody there, so he goes over to Hirsch's and bangs, gets on their porch, bangs on the door, and F.E. Hirsch comes to the door, and Jim says something like, "She's dead. They're dead." And of course, he's covered with blood. And Mr. Hirsch, you don't have telephone, you can't call the police. I mean, somebody's got to run and get him. So Hirsch didn't want to let Jim in the house, but he kind of cracked the door a little bit and was talking to him, and Jim seemed awful confused. So in this account you can read in several newspapers. We had 4 or 5 newspapers at that time, and the account of the whole situation is in those newspapers. But Jim went back over to the house, and while he was over there was a gunshot, and Hirsch, was watching all this was going on, saw a flash and then heard the gunshot, so he figured that Jim had done himself in. He'd committed suicide. Well, Jim actually tried, and when he shot himself, he missed. And the bullet kind of grazed off his skull on the right side and cut him bad, but didn't kill him, and he was bleeding from his head. He went back over to Hirsch's, and he actually got some blood on their porch when he went back over there. But Hirsch again wouldn't let him in the house. Jim wanted a glass of water, and he gave him handed him a glass of water, but wouldn't let him in the house. Well, anyway, Jim took off, headed down Clark Street towards town. And Nanning Fruden had a lumber yard up there about where, it's up on North Main, kind of kitty corner from where the dollar store is right now. Jim went in the house. Nan lived right there next to the lumber yard. Well, Jim went up to the lumber yard and went to the house, and he probably got there, let's call it 5 o'clock in the morning in January. It was cold, it was icy. And he banged on the door and woke Nanning up. And Nanning invited him in, and Nan's son, Bill Fruden, who passed away about 50 years ago, was upstairs, and they had those gravity feed heat ducts, so you could look right down to the next floor, and he listened to Jim tell what had happened. And, you know, Jim was saying that she wanted the money and he had to save himself because she was going to kill him, and it was a kind of a confession of some sorts, but he was throwing in, you know, why he did it, because he was afraid she was going to wake up and kill him when he was sleeping on that cot. Well, anyway, Nan talked him into saying, you know, we got to get the police involved in this thing, and so he said, you need to go down and turn yourself in. So Jim headed down the street. Well, he got down there a little ways, and you know, the word kind of got out. I suppose he was there maybe an hour and a half at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. And you know, back in those days, you didn't have a radio or TV or anything. Weren't many telephones. It was all word of mouth. Well, this was like wildfire. Jim Cullen, who chased kids, was a mean man. Nobody liked, but you had to do business with him because he made wooden tanks. I mean, the math's all coming together, and it's like he killed Ella and he killed Roy, and what's he going to do next? So they arrested him and put him in jail. The jail in those days, the courthouse is the same place it is now. The jail was, they just tore those buildings down to the west of the jail, but the jail was across the street, and the sheriff lived over there. And so the sheriff arrested Jim and threw him in jail. He was in that jail, and this is January 8th. Now, I got one of these newspapers sitting here, and we'll show some of this maybe in a little bit, but this newspaper was all typeset. And by 9 o'clock in the morning, now remember this murder happened at 4, by 9 o'clock in the morning, the grand jury was already having an inquest. And they've got the testimony from everybody here, and this newspaper is kind of an interesting newspaper because it was done on January 8th. The same day, I think this is January 9th, a January 9th newspaper, but this information was all taken on January 8th and was ready for print in some of the newspapers yet that same day. I know the Intelligencer got the article in the same day. This was a once-a-week paper. This is the Herald. And they've got the accounts of everybody that was involved in this thing. F.E. Hirsch's testimony, L.A. Reid's testimony, Bill Cullen's testimony, that's all in there. What did you see? What happened? Tell us the story and everything else. And when the newspapers came out, everybody was, you know, they were real upset about this. So a small group of guys decided that they were going to take the law into their own hands, and they were going to go to the jail that night of January 8th, and they were going to get Jim out, and they were going to take care of him, meaning take care of him, get rid of him permanently. And they went that night about 6 o'clock. The sheriff's name was Schermerhorn. I think it was Charles. And there was a Brand who still got relatives in Charles City. I think it was William Brand. And he was town constable. So you had the sheriff and the constable, and they were there at the jail guarding Cullen. And this group of guys, I'd say there were maybe 10 of them. Now, one of them was Orlando Hill, because Orlando Hill and Fat Eastman were best friends. They'd gotten in trouble earlier in school, and they actually got sent away to the soldiers' home in Davenport and spent some time. That was like Eldora, you know, a place for wayward kids. And they were best friends. And when Orlando found out that Roy had been killed, he'd heard there'd been a murder, and he lived out east of town where his sister was out there, and he'd gotten a horse and buggy and came in, and he was pretty upset about this whole deal. Well, you can imagine what would happen if, you know, somebody shot your best friend. And so this group of about 10 guys went to the jail, and the sheriff came out and the constable came out and said, we want Cullen. No, you're not going to have him. We're going to do this the way it's supposed to be done. There'll be a trial, everything will come out fine, but you're not going to have Cullen. And they kicked back and forth for a while, and finally the guys broke up and left. So Jim spent the night in jail, and he was afraid, you know, something might happen, something bad might happen. Well, the next day, of course, in Charles City, this is it's all over town. This is all anybody's talking about. Nobody, it's Jim Cullen, and he murdered these two, and nobody's going to be safe, and we've got to do something about him. And there'd been a case down in Butler County, just south of here, where there was a guy by the name of Bussy, B-U-S-S-E, and he committed some murders. Killed a couple people, and there was a governor by the name of Cummins, and he commuted his sentence, which meant that I think that means he made the sentence easier for him. We're going to give him a chance to get out rather than keep him in jail. And that had really irritated a lot of people in 1906. So now we're early in 1907. It's January 9th now, 24 hours since the murder had happened that morning. And everybody in town was afraid that, they thought commuting a sentence was mean let somebody go. So they got to talking, and a bunch of people in this group decided that they needed to put a plan together because they wanted to get him this night. They wanted to be rid of the guy. So they put a plan together. It was a pretty sophisticated plan because they met down by the river, not far from where the house was, and they decided that night they were going to ride up to the Illinois Central Section House, which is up across from the chicken plant. And then the Hildreth Theater was open, and they had a road show that night. It was a Wednesday night. Murders were committed on a Tuesday morning. This is a Wednesday night. And they decided that they were going to get a group of people together, but they needed to have a big crowd to make this thing work. So what they decided to do, or what they actually did, was they knew that show would get out about 10:30 at the Hildreth. Now remember, everybody's talked about this. This is a big deal. So about 10 o'clock, they went up to the Illinois Central Section House in a bobsledding team because it was icy. There was ice everywhere. They took a bobsledding team, a bunch of horses, and there were a group of about 25 guys. They went up the Illinois Central Section House and they got a rail. They hooked that rail behind the bobsledding team and they headed down Main Street. And they went by, they didn't go down Main Street until they saw that the road show was getting out at the Hildreth Hotel. And that hotel opera house held about 1,000 people. It was big. It was like the auditorium at the middle school, the old middle school. So they went down Main Street and they went right by that Hildreth Hotel as the show was getting out. And here's you got a big crowd and 1,000 people, and as they're going by, they're pulling that rail and they're shooting guns and making noise and hooting and hollering. And you can imagine everybody that came out of that opera house took a right and they headed right down Main Street towards the bridge. We had an iron bridge in those days on Main Street. Later on they moved that bridge over to St. Mary's, but they had an iron bridge on Main Street. And that came into play it was a plank bridge. And so when you went across it, the planks had, it had a different sound to it. But all these people went down there. And the lead group of guys that pulled this rail, these 20, 25 guys that they put together in this group, they went right over to the jail. And the sheriff came out and said, "Boys, we told you last night there's going to be none of this." And this is a quote I got from Orlando because he was there, because Roy was his best friend and he was one of the guys that pulled this off. One of the guys in the group yelled, "Schermerhorn, Brand, you get out of the way or we're going to string you right up next to him. And we're going to do it." And they just stepped to the side and didn't try to stop anybody. Those guys took that rail and they got into the jail. They battered down the jail door. They grabbed Cullen. Orlando said he bit a guy's finger off when they were dragging him out of the jail. They slid him down the hill from where the jail was, kind of where the Davico car wash was. Slid him down the hill to the bridge and got him down to the bridge. Orlando said they sang Sherman's Marching Through Georgia when they, as they were sliding him, pulling him, dragging him down to the bridge. Got him down there. They guessed the web guessed there may be 1,000 people. Orlando said 1,000 that had congregated down there. So that would be the Hildreth group plus the other people that went down there because they knew something was going to happen. This is about 10:55 at night now. They got down there, and a guy by the name of Bill Bolander said they paid him they raised $1,000 to get him to tie a noose. But a guy by the name of Bill Bullender tied a noose. There was a man, ironically enough, by the name of Roper, Ensign Roper for the Salvation Army. He was there. He prayed for him. And what they did is they got Jim down about 20 paces onto the bridge, put the noose over his neck, had a hold of him so he couldn't move, and they raised him up. A group of guys raised him up in the air, and they had a hold of him. And he was kind of fighting, and then he kind of settled down. I think he realized what was going to happen. And somebody yelled out from the crowd, "Let's fill him full of lead." And there was no shooting. There's going to be no shooting. Orlando says there's no shooting. We're going to do this in a civilized manner. Like this would be very civilized. But they raised him up. And Ensign Roper prayed for him. And contrary to what a lot of people think, they threw the rope up over the middle of the bridge on the iron. And a lot of people think they tied the rope off and then threw him over the bridge and he hung off the side of the bridge. No, he hung in the middle of the bridge. They raised him up and then they prayed for him. Right before they did that, E.M. Sherman, who was a friend of Jim's, the Sherman Nursery Sherman, he came down from his house, which was where the bed and breakfast was. He came down from his house and said something like, "You boys ought to be ashamed of yourselves," or something like that. And somebody said, "You better go or something bad's going to happen to you too." And he disappeared. They raised Jim way up in the air and then they just dropped him. A bunch of guys had a hold of the rope and they kind of pulled on the rope when they let him down. And there are a couple eyewitness accounts that said that they kept track of his pulse, that he didn't die for maybe 9 minutes. So my guess is it probably didn't, it wasn't like a regular hanging where your neck breaks. They might have choked him to death. But he was, after about 9 minutes, he died. Then they took that rope and tied the other end of the rope off to a side iron. And they pulled him up high and tied him off, and they let him hang there. He swung there all night long. They didn't take him down till the next morning. And it was Webb said, because he was only 12 years old, he said it was a pretty gruesome sight. But he said there were a lot of kids down there, a lot of people down there that wanted to see it done. Now the newspaper the next day said, there was an article at the bottom said, who were the people that did the lynching? And they said there was a guy by the name of Henry Townsend from Nashua that said people had organized 1,000 strong to come to Charles City to string Cullen up. Well, that was just because Mrs. Eastman was from down there. It probably was the reason that to keep anybody from getting into trouble. They had a grand jury investigation and inquest. Nobody got in trouble for anything. Just kind of came and went. And Jim was gone, and he had a daughter in Michigan that came and settled up his estate. And everybody was surprised about that because they never heard about a daughter before. One story that Webb told me was when salesmen with the Hart Parwood Company, when people would come into town to do business with a Hart Par, that when the conductor would holler out Charles City, people would say, do you want to be careful in this town? You get in trouble in this town, they'll string you up. And Charles City for a long time had a reputation as being a pretty rough town. Now, is it a story that you want to be proud of? For a long time, nobody admitted that they were there. Nobody didn't talk about it. The parents told the kids, don't say anything about it. Don't just, what was done, forget about it. They were better off because it happened. Then after a few generations went by, there were lots of people were there. Once they figured out that probably been long enough. But it was a story that I learned when I was very young, and one that I've always continued to research and look for. And I've been fortunate that I've picked up some newspapers and some other things related to the lynching. But it's a part of Charles City's history, and the history, as you know, some of the stuff is good and some of the stuff's bad, but it's a story that I learned, and I really appreciated the fact that Orlando and Webb took the time to tell me that about the Cullen lynching. fun to tell it today. Thanks.